Hey, good evening, everybody. I see the chat is already hopping out there. I saw, let's see, I saw a bunch of people saying where they're from. If you have not already said hi and told us where you're from, I'd love to get a sense of where people are out there. I saw a few folks from Washington. Hello to my peeps from Washington. North Carolina. Oh, look at all my Oli friends. Hey, guys. California, New York, Bama, nice. All right, we're getting all kinds of people showing up. Welcome, everybody. My name's Melissa, and I'll let you introduce yourself.
Oh, my name's Charlie. I'm a student streamer.
Yeah, and I'm a teacher. I teach AP World in Olympia, Washington, and I stream here for Fiveable. So let me get my slides shared so you can see what I'm talking about, and we'll go from here. There we are. All right. I want to get it so you can see the slides a little bit bigger, and normally I can do that with the click of a focus screen. That's the one I want. There we go. Now you can all see things a little bit better. Welcome, everybody. Tonight we are going to talk together about Indigenous responses to state expansion. So this is specifically a subsection of Unit 6. We, for these Thursday night streams, are working on covering content that is going to be tested on the newly revised AP World exams. You may see there's some additional streams being added to our calendar, some of which will be bonus content from Units 7, 8, and 9, the 20th century. But if you're tuning in on Thursdays, this content will be it's at least eligible to be tested. I don't know on a 45-minute exam exactly how much is going to be tested, but this is eligible, and so this is really good content for you. And especially if you were wanting to pursue those lessons in the 20th century, understanding some of this 19th century content provides you really good context for that 20th century history. So just a reminder that this is our basic stream calendar. So these are our like traditional content that will be tested, streams in all our different subjects, and everything on Fiveable is free. So just show up, say hi, come watch a replay, download a video. If you've got a friend who does not have reliable internet and they can't do these streams because it takes up too much bandwidth, they can download our videos and watch after the fact. So spread the word. We're out there trying to make content that is accessible and available to as many students as possible, because I'm guessing a lot of you are in the same boat as me. You've been home for many days, and it may be many more days before you get to leave home. So let's bring you the good stuff while we're here. Charlie, are you attending any streams for subjects you're studying?
Fiveable, just European so far.
European? Yeah, we got some good streams going out for Euro, don't we?
Yeah, we actually do. Like, I know this week is, they're around the same period as us. We're going over the same exact periods of time. So it's kind of nice to go to the Euro and see their streams because they're really good. And then we get a different perspective from like a worldly view too, especially because this is a very like Eurocentric part of history.
It can be, yeah. Tonight we're really going to try and focus on people who are not Europeans. But if you are wanting some supplemental content, those AP Euro streams might be a good supplemental resource for folks wanting to work on some of that. Quick reminder, right, that Fiveable is out there on the socials. If you're wanting to kind of know what's happening or what's coming up with Fiveable, subscribe to us on the socials. We got a good team putting out really cool content there, making sure that you're in the know of what's happening and what's to come. Tonight, it's a brief agenda, but we got actually a lot to cover. So we're going to start with kind of just an overview of responses of Indigenous peoples, because there are a lot of different kinds of responses. This is one of those topics in world history where students will ask me, hey, how did people respond to those European imperialists? And I always have to start my answer with, well, it depends on who you're talking about. So we'll do an overview of some different types of responses. Then we'll break down some examples, some specific examples of resistance kinds of responses. And then I have a couple of short answer question practices for you. Because knowing that the AP exam is going to be all free response and it's only 45 minutes long, I would say the best skills we could be practicing right now are our short answer response skills. Because in order for the College Board to ask you more than one question in 45 minutes, I'm putting my money on an SAQ. I don't know about you. So
45 minutes would be terrible.
Right. Well, students were asking me today, do you think there'll be a DBQ? And I was like, I can't write a DBQ in 45 minutes. And I've been doing this for years. So
maybe,
yeah.
But I would guess an SAQ because you have the 3 course to grade.
Yeah. People are saying, what about an LEQ? It's possible, right, that we could just get one big question. Realistically, if they're trying to say, hey, we really did cover units 1 through 6, it's probably going to be an SAQ. Just throwing that out there. All right. So a couple of reminders before we dive into content. You are welcome in the chat to post questions, respond to people's questions. The chat's moving pretty fast, so we might miss your question here on the stream, but we do have some teachers in the chat who can follow up with you on questions. If there's a question you definitely want us to answer out loud, there's the ask a question button that you can use, and you can type your question there and it'll give us a little flag that says, hey, someone's got a question, and I can make sure we get an answer for you there. So 2 options for participating and getting your questions answered. So as we're thinking about Indigenous responses, I want you to think about like putting yourself in the shoes of Indigenous peoples, right? As the industrial powers, and I'm going to try to say industrial powers or imperialists rather than Europeans, because the Europeans weren't the only imperialists in the 19th century, right? We also have American empire builders and we have Japanese empire builders. So we want to be a little bit careful there. But as these industrial powers start expanding into new territories, right? If you were in one of these communities and a group of people comes in and tells you that everything that you know and believe about your government, your culture, your ways of doing life was uncivilized, right? They came in, they called you savages and barbarians, and they told you that they were coming in to fix everything about your civilization, what would your response be to that? Charlie, how would you respond?
Well, I obviously wouldn't be happy about it. Well, people have different responses, and we're going to see that. We have like some completely, what we learn in history a lot are kind of passive responses. A lot like, oh, I accept it and I'm going to assimilate in this culture. But this, most of the examples that we're seeing today, if not all of them, are going to be people fighting for their cultures back, for those rights that they had previously before, I'm going to say, European colonization.
Yeah, or if they, in some cases, folks are resisting imperialism in order to go back to a previous way of living. But in other cases, we see Indigenous peoples wanting to take some of the elements of industrialization, especially, but to own it for themselves and just simply to retain independence or to retain self-rule, while choosing which changes to adopt and which changes not to adopt. So as we're talking today, I want us to keep in mind that the Indigenous peoples that we are talking about were and are, right, very active humans who are making decisions, making choices, taking action on behalf of themselves and their people throughout their histories. And that imperialism, right, wasn't inevitable. It wasn't just a foregone conclusion that the imperialists were going to win, that the resistance movements, really, even the ones that were in the end unsuccessful are still really significant, because at the time of resistance, no one knew for sure what the outcome was going to be. And as we'll see tonight, some of these resistance movements did have significant positive outcomes for the people involved. So just kind of a framework for us to be thinking about. We've got 4 categories of responses that we can think about. And I just want to blast through these really quickly so we can dive into some specific examples. So we talked already about the idea of resistance, and we see groups who rejected European dominance. This is going to be the focus of our time here, so I didn't put a lot of detail on this slide, but it's worth acknowledging, right, that the resistance counts, whether it's successful or unsuccessful. So we're going to keep an eye on that. We've got groups who saw the expansion of imperialist powers and the threat that those imperialists pose, and tried to reform internally to resist and compete with those powers. China, the Ottomans, and Japan all made attempts at reform. Japan was the only state of those 3 to successfully resist European imperialism, and the reforms in Japan actually enabled them to turn around and become imperialists themselves. We'll see examples about nationalism on some of these slides, and it's just worth mentioning here that nationalists and anti-imperialist movements sometimes went hand in hand, and we actually see in the 19th century the creation of some newly independent states acting against previously existing empires. And so they kind of get folded into this like indigenous responses category in the way that the College Board structures things. So we'll mention them briefly here. And then it is worth acknowledging, right, that some people, especially some elites within indigenous societies, saw value in agreeing to European terms, largely because it allowed them the opportunity to retain power and maybe even some measure of autonomy or independence within a larger European empire. And I give the example here, this isn't in the College Board exam description, and it's not in a lot of textbooks, but I think it's a really interesting one, just to remember the diversity of responses. And so I have the example here of Lesotho. There was one chief who brought together a whole bunch of different groups of people in Southern Africa who had been displaced from their homelands by Dutch Boer expansion and by Zulu expansion in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And he essentially created a kingdom from scratch in the 19th century, which he then turned around and negotiated to turn over his kingdom to the British as what's called a protectorate. And a protectorate is different from a colony because it means that the king got to retain authority within the kingdom, and then he was a subject under the authority of the English crown. And this decision allowed him to maintain his authority over his land and his people, and he was governed directly by Britain rather than being folded into South Africa. And it's part of the reason why Lesotho exists as an independent country today, is that those decisions made during this era of imperialism led this country to its creation and its independence in 1966. So sometimes, right, accommodation or working with Europeans was a real positive. Sometimes it was a real negative. And so there's a huge diversity of different movements within these different groups that we're going to talk about. Did I miss anything, Charlie?
I don't think so. I think we're good.
Okay. All right. Charlie's got some really good detail about some of these examples, which is why I'm just blasting through initial content to get us rolling. I'm seeing people doing a great job in the chat of responding to questions there. So keep that up, friends. You guys are awesome. I said we were going to talk mostly about resistance. So again, breaking things down into categories just to give you an overview of what we're talking about. 3 categories of indigenous resistance: direct resistance, the creation of new states, and cultural and religious-based rebellion. So we're going to break down each of these into its own slide with some detail. I see a question in the question box. I'm going to pop it open really quick before we move to the next slide. So give me just a second. Dan is asking about the Xhosa cattle killing movement, and we are going to talk about that when we talk about cultural and religious-based rebellions. So I have seen your question, Dan, and I will make sure that we get some information on that to you in this stream. All right. Direct resistance. Give you a quick definition, and then we'll go through some examples. So direct resistance would be violent or non-violent, right? You can have resistance in either of those ways, or sometimes a mix. These are movements that either sought to prevent takeover by an imperialist power, or a movement that tried to remove the imperialists from power. We got 3 examples of these. Charlie, you want to talk to us about the 1857 rebellion in India while I get some water for my scratchy throat?
Yeah. So the 1857 rebellion in India, it's also known as the Sepoy Mutiny, which is what I learned it as. So, so basically, the Sepoy Mutiny was an example of a violent movement, which was based completely off of a rumor. So this has to do with British rule in India, and the Brits weren't really respecting any of the cultures in India. And we studied India throughout this entire course. We know that India is a place of a lot of religions. You have Hindus, you have Muslims, you have Sikhs, you have other people. This focuses solely on Hindus and Muslims. So we know that Hindus and Muslims, they respect certain animals in the religion, and they have different dietary restrictions. So there was this rumor that was going around that the British cartridges that they were using had been dipped in beef and pork fat so they could slide out easier. And this offended Muslims because they don't eat pork. This offended Hindus because they respect cows in their religion. So it started a rebellion against the East India Company, which is Britain was in charge of the East India Company. And this is an example as an unsuccessful one, because eventually the British forces did defeat the Indians in northern India, and India became officially a British colony as a result of this.
Right. So when we give examples of these different resistance movements, we are going to have some examples like this of resistance that ended not only in the defeat of the resistors, but in this case, right, a further strengthening of imperialist control in India. And so some resistance movements are successful, some are unsuccessful. And knowing a little bit about both can be really useful for you. You don't have to memorize every example that we give tonight, but it's a good idea to think about different kinds of examples that could stick in your mind and allow you to give some detail if you were asked a question about a direct resistance movement. The second example that I want us to talk about is resistance and war in Ethiopia. So this is conflict. This one's a really interesting one because this was not a rebellion against an imperialist power that was already in Africa, but rather a resistance movement against an attempt at an imperialist takeover. So Italy and Ethiopia were signing a treaty in which Ethiopia was granting that Italy could claim territory in what is now Eritrea. But the Italians who wrote the treaty in such a way that they used that it meant that Italy could actually claim control of all of Ethiopia. The Ethiopians were smart and had someone like walk them through this Italian translation and notice, right, and the translators noticed that there was a discrepancy between the Italian version of the treaty and the Ethiopian version of the treaty. And so the Ethiopians mustered their military, and when the Italians showed up to claim the land, the Ethiopians were there and ready for them. And they were able to push the Italians completely out of East Africa, not just out of Ethiopia, but out of Eritrea, the territory that they had been granted by the treaty as well. And so this is an example of a victorious African movement, accomplished in part because the Ethiopians had been stockpiling industrial weapons, and they actually had better weapons than the Italians that they had purchased from other European powers earlier in the 19th century. The success of the Ethiopian military through the use of rifles and artillery and machine guns and all of those industrial technologies that hopefully you talked about with the Industrial Revolution actually allowed Ethiopia to remain one of the few independent portions of Africa, even as the scramble for Africa was dividing up the rest of the continent among different European powers. The Italians, and Dan's pointing out, right, the Italians come back for revenge near the beginning of World War II, but British and Indian forces, as Mr. Beckman is pointing out, right, come back again to support the Ethiopians and push the Italians back out of that territory. So it remains conflicted territory in East Africa. And then our third example is, so we had one kind of unequivocal defeat for Indigenous peoples, one victory for Indigenous peoples. And then our third example is kind of a more mixed example. This is another conflict that has multiple names, the Asantewa War, or the War of the Golden Stool in Ashanti territory in West Africa. Charlie, did you study this one when you were learning world history?
No, but art history, this is the War of the Golden Stool, because one of the required works for AP Art History is the Golden Stool. Oh,
fantastic. Tell us about the Golden Stool.
So the Golden Stool is essentially what it sounds like. It's a golden stool, but it's almost, it's a religious item that could not be sat on or touched in any way by someone that wasn't of like a high status in society. So a British invader came, sat on it unknowingly, and it basically erupted into this whole thing because the English were trying to gain territory in what was Ashanti territory, and because they sat on this stool, it erupted into something completely destructive.
Yeah, there was this massive rebellion because of the British disrespect of the Golden Stool, and we end up with this kind of back and forth where the rebellion of the Ashanti people leads to the British kidnapping and exile of the Ashanti king, who then, the Queen Mother, leads another wave of rebellion against the British to get the king back and restore his proper authority over their people. And so, right, this is right at the end of the 19th century. The biggest battles are actually in 1900, technically the beginning of the 20th century, but it's still part of this Unit 6 imperialism story. So if you're looking at that date going, that's not going to be relevant for the exam, the College Board is always a little fuzzy on dates. But the interesting thing, I think, as I was kind of rereading about this conflict is the end result, because the Ashanti were annexed, they were absorbed into the British Empire, but the British never fully controlled the Ashanti people. The Ashanti rulers and their cultural authority over their people remained in place, even as the British assumed like political authority in the region. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag. There's some defeat on the one hand because the Ashanti didn't remain like a separate and independent country, but there's also some victory there because their resistance and their rebellion was strong enough that the British realized it wasn't worth trying to fully dominate and directly control that region. And so they would suppress active rebellion in the region, but then largely allow the traditional elites to be the actual on-the-ground political rulers in the region. So when we're talking about direct resistance, right, we've got an example of defeat, an example of victory for Indigenous people, and a kind of mixed example where there's some defeat, some victory for the Indigenous people. So India, Ethiopia, that's East Africa, and then West Africa for Ya Asantewa. And again, the chat is moving so fast. You guys are doing a great job answering questions, helping each other out. So awesome job. You ready for the next one, Charlie?
Yeah.
Okay. This one is a little, again, I was saying before, this one's a little weird to just shoehorn in this section, but this is where the College Board places this content in terms of how people are studying this. And I think that's valid, that that when we're talking about resistance to empires, we have to remember that there were empires in the 19th century that existed before the industrial powers started creating their bigger empires, right? We had empire in Russia, we had empire in China, we have empire in Ottoman territory, and these anti-imperialist movements existed against those older empires as well as against the newer, quote unquote, empires from Europe, Japan, and the United States. So, Charlie, did you study the emergence of independent states in the Balkans or on the edges of the Ottoman Empire in world history?
In world history, yes, but this was around like the World War I. We kind of fused this when we did World War I, when it was like the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, and then we'd go over not pretty much like World War I was all because of nationalism, extreme nationalism in these states.
Okay,
so that's when.
So what's interesting, and for those of you who haven't studied World War I yet, because you got cut off by all of the school disruptions this year, some of what we're talking about here does have a relationship to Unit 7 and World War I, but I think it's important to note that nationalism in Eastern Europe and what's known as the Balkans, so it's this region in kind of Eastern Europe, almost into the Middle East, right where Turkey is about, there's Turkey and then it touches Eastern Europe. And this region, we actually see the emergence of nationalism and anti-imperialism in the 19th century. And we see states like Greece declaring independence and Romania declaring independence and you can see on the map that I have on the screen here, places like Serbia, and Serbia is going to play a big role in the story of World War I, but the Bulgaria, Albania, these are all states that were attempting to declare independence from the Ottoman Empire. And these nationalist movements have a lot of similarities with European nationalist movements that you may have studied in Unit 5. So kind of taking you back to Unit 5, thinking about nationalism in Europe. What were the nationalists in Europe as they were creating new states and redrawing their national borders? And this is kind of an open question for anybody in the chat too. What were some of the characteristics of nationalism that the Europeans were drawing on? Like, how were they forming their nationalist identities? Language. Yeah, one of the key characteristics would be shared language. And we see that here in Eastern Europe, right? The Greeks speaking Greek, not speaking Turkish or Arabic. So they're not seeing themselves as being part of the Ottoman Empire. Culture and religion, right? A lot of these places on the fringes of the Ottoman Empire that are wanting to create new states are not predominantly Muslim regions. There are Muslims living in the region, but there are Eastern Orthodox Christians, especially in many of these regions, drawing away from Muslim rule. Ethnicity and race, identifying not as Turkish or as Ottoman, but identifying as Serbian or Bulgarian or Greek or Albanian, right? So all of these things that the Europeans, the Italians, the Germans, and other folks in Europe itself used to create their national identities in the 18th and 19th centuries. These new independent states are using exactly the same language and rhetoric to justify their anti-imperialist movements against the Ottoman Empire. And so that's a good tie-in for you as you're thinking about Unit 5 to Unit 6. It's also a good way to remember that it's not just the Europeans who were nationalists. We've got other groups as well. All right, I've got a question here that I think is relevant to this slide before we go on to the next one. So Rebecca is asking the question, did ethnicity and race come before the nationalist movements? I would say yes, asterisk, in a sense that, right, people are self-identifying and they are finding characteristics and definitions to define themselves and separate themselves from any other group out there. So in that sense, the idea of identity being formed around shared characteristics, yes, that would predate nationalism. I also think that our language about race and ethnicity comes very much out of like nationalist rhetoric. And so there's also a sense in which you could say that the idea of nationalism is also what gave us ideas about race and ethnicity. So it's kind of a both and, a yes asterisk. Mr. Beckman in the chat is saying that's a really advanced question, and it is, Rebecca. That's a super advanced question. I think the key for nationalism is to remember that people are finding and defining characteristics and then saying, we have these shared characteristics and we have this shared territory, so we should be our own country. And for the 19th century, that's the foundational piece of what we need to remember about nationalism, especially as it relates to anti-imperialist movements. Okay, here's the one, boom, that people have been asking about, the cultural and religion-based rebellions. And again, Mr. Beckman mentioned this earlier, and I want to say it here. We're trying to give multiple examples so that you can see how these things play out in history. But you don't have to memorize every example. If you're seeing an example that you're like, that was nowhere in my textbook and my teacher never mentioned that, that's okay. If you know an example from these different buckets, then you're in really good shape in terms of what you need to know. So some rebellions and resistance movements were not just fought in practical terms. There was also a religious or cultural element to them. And we had a question right at the beginning about the Xhosa cattle killing movement. So let's talk about that one first. Charlie, you want to talk about the Xhosa? Or you want me to do it?
So there was a sickness in these cattle. We don't really know exactly what it is. I'm not really sure, but it was a zoonosis, which what we'd call nowadays just a disease that affects animals. And a lot of these cattle were getting really sick, and in a territory which is now in South Africa, Southern Africa, and it was under Dutch and British rule, as you mentioned before with the Boers. So there is the beginning of a spiritual movement, and we'll see that a lot of these are examples of spiritual movements. And the people started to believe that if they killed their cattle, then they would be saved or cured, and this wouldn't escalate into even greater issue.
Yeah.
So,
Dan had asked, like, when did this occur? And this is the 1850s.
Yeah.
We didn't get the date put up on the slide, and I apologize for that, Dan. But so we're looking mid-19th century, 1850s for this movement. Sorry. Go ahead, Charlie.
So their belief basically told them that their cattle would be reborn, almost like a reincarnation sort of process, that they would return to their earth if the people killed them. And that if they killed them, then the white settlers, the Dutch and the British, would leave by those same spirits. So this did not come true. And because they had killed so many cattle as a result of this, tens of thousands of these people died in a famine. And the British governor, who was in this area at the time, he refused to help the people unless they essentially gave up their land and worked for the British. So it was a loss of power, a loss of food, a loss of territory. It was incredibly upsetting for the people.
And a fairly controversial movement in Southern Africa. It was controversial at the time. There was a lot of disagreement among Xhosa about like how much to believe the prophecies of the young women who had these visions, but also controversy after the fact about exactly what happened when and who was at fault. It is for sure true that a lot of cattle died from the disease, for sure true that a lot of cattle were killed by the people, and the loss of cattle resulted in famine. Like those things are fairly well established, but the question about like how much were the British to blame for the famine? Could the British have stopped the famine? That is more argued by historians. But it is definitely a resistance movement, right? We see this spiritual component, this belief that if they took this action, then the spirits and the ancestors would strengthen the people and would help them succeed. And the loss was especially devastating because it was a cultural loss, a loss of land, a loss of population due to famine. Like, it was a really just devastating loss to Xhosa people, and strengthened British control, particularly in Southern Africa. We've got another spiritual movement to talk about in North America. So Charlie, why don't you talk to us about the ghost dance, and I'll talk about the Maji Maji.
So the ghost dance is something that you may have gone over if anyone's taking a push or any type of United States history course when you get into these 1800s. So it was this traditional ceremony for many Native American societies that they would do for good luck or change. And the leaders of certain Native American tribes would use these types of dances because they believed that it would allow them to reunite with their ancestors, and it would provide them with good luck, prosperity, and in this case, unity, because the white colonists were trying to expand into further parts of the United States. So what they did was they had the ghost dance to make white colonists leave and to bring peace in mostly the Midwest, the Western United States. So this was the Lakota people mainly, the Paiute people, and they did this as the United States government expanded its territory westward across the nation, and we could see that eventually they did colonize the rest of the United States.
Yeah, there's some suggestion that the spiritual ideas of the ghost dance movement and the suppression of the ghost dance movement by the U.S. government was one of the reasons for the wars that occurred as the Lakota and other peoples resisted the encroachment of U.S. forces. And Evan wants to remind us that the buffalo are really significant. Of course, the conflict over that resource and the importance of the buffalo in Indigenous North American societies. So there's a lot to unpack with that, but I liked including it here, not just because the College Board mentions it, but because it shows us that we've got these spiritual movements and practices happening in different parts of the world. So the Maji Maji Rebellion is another example that's technically 20th century, but again, it's 1905 to 1907. So it's still really in our window of Indigenous resistance movements. And hi, Orion. I'm going to give you a shout out because you said hi to me. That was one of my students who just popped in the chat. So I miss you guys. But the Maji Maji Rebellion is in modern day Tanzania, so East Africa again. And I saw in the chat earlier, people were talking about, isn't this the one with the like magic water? Yes, there was a war medicine being produced by spiritual leaders that was said to make people invulnerable. It was supposed to make men invulnerable to bullets so that they would fight. It would make women and children strong so that they could flee battles if they needed to. And the spread and the belief in this medicine encouraged Indigenous Africans to rebel against the Germans. And similar to the Xhosa, when the actual like direct resistance rebellion was squashed, as punishment for the rebellion, as punishment for continuing in what the Germans saw as primitive and savage beliefs. The German leadership actually not just like refused to help people who were starving, but actually initiated a scorched earth campaign, meaning that they destroyed crops in the region and prevented people from having access to food, resulting in another massive famine and the deaths of thousands of Indigenous Africans after the failure of this rebellion and punishment. And for all three of these examples, it's really easy to roll our eyes at the spiritual beliefs and practices because they differ so much from our 21st century perspective, right? We don't live, at least in the United States, in a world where prophecies and magic and these kinds of beliefs are commonplace. You might in the place where you live, but for much of our country, we don't. And looking back as historians, we can kind of be like, well, of course they failed. They're based on something we don't believe in. But it's helpful to remember that these spiritual beliefs, including the prophecies and the magic, had been ingrained in these cultures for thousands of years. And it's really only very recently that these ideas are much more rejected by peoples. So just, I don't know, take that with a grain of salt. I see folks in the chat saying, well, you know, were there any successful examples of the cultural and religious-based rebellions? The ghost dance is probably a really good example. We know that the end result is defeat of the indigenous peoples of North America and the expansion of the United States, but there were some hard fought battles. And when you get into US history, you're going to talk about this in a lot more detail. And so of the three examples here, the ghost dance is probably the closest to military success, maybe, that we would talk about. But all three of these were successful in the sense that they strengthened the people's will to resist and rebel against the imperialist force. Mr. Little also mentions in the chat, right, another way to think of this question is, do these cultures still exist? And the answer is yes. All of these cultures still exist within like new states that were either created for them in Tanzania and in South Africa, or within, right, their place in the United States for the indigenous peoples of North America. Yeah. Orion, if you're having trouble with audio or video, you might try refreshing. I know you can't hear me. Somebody in the chat wants to tell them to refresh the page and kind of restart the stream. That often happens, or that fixes things for me. So, there's people in the chat hooking us up. All right, we are at 42 minutes. We've answered all the questions in the questions box. Are you guys ready for some SAQ practice? Okay, the first SAQ I'm going to throw up here is a stimulus-based SAQ. So I'm going to ask you some questions about the stimulus before I have you actually answer the prompts. You're going to see the SAQ prompts up there. That's totally fine. You can start thinking about those. But the first thing I want you to do is take a look at the stimulus. I realize our pictures are covering up some of the caption that I put here, so I will read that for you. And yes, William, I would love for you to answer SAQ stuff in the chat today. Okay, so this is a picture by Henri Meyer. It's called The Capture of Touré Samari. Samari Touré is an African leader by Lieutenant Joaquin near Guillermo in 1898. Can't read my own screen. The text is so tiny. So what do you see? First of all, just what do you see going on in the picture? Horses, okay? Got people on horseback? Yep. What are they doing? Dude stabbing it, or dude, is it grabbing another dude? And yeah, grabbing another dude with a sword. There's a battle, there's fighting. I'm sorry the pic is really blurry for you. There's a white horse and a black horse. We've got different guys on horseback. Looks like a soldier is killing a native person or attacking a native person. A battle between European and African forces. Good catch there, William. That's going to be really helpful to you because I intentionally picked this because it's an example that we did not cover in the slides. And that could happen on the AP exam. They could pick an example you didn't specifically cover, but you could still figure some things out and make some inferences. So our first question is an identify. So this can be a really short answer. You don't have to do an ACE or anything like that. What response to imperialism do you see in this image? Write it as a complete sentence, but it could literally be one sentence. Okay, Dan's got an answer for us. Anybody else want to put it into a complete sentence? Awesome. Rebecca's got a great sentence. Tanya is giving us an identify with a little bit of extra detail. Also works. Awesome. Okay, so things I'm seeing. It was violent resistance. There was direct resistance leading to war. We see rebellion in this image shown by the sword that the European is holding. The image depicts violent battle between imperialist European forces and African forces. And Eric is mentioning, Mr. Beckman is mentioning, right, what Tanya did, referencing the image, saying something about the image and how it shows direct resistance or violent resistance. Both of those would both be really great answers. Identifying that there's a European and an African would be another way to show your reference to the image. So you didn't even know who Samori Touré is necessarily. I mean, maybe some of you do, but a lot of you don't, because we didn't talk about it tonight, and you could still answer part A. Awesome. Part B, it's a describe prompt. So we need just a little bit more detail from you. But again, not a full, huge, long answer, just maybe one or two complete sentences. Part B says, describe another response to imperialism beyond what was shown in the image. So take a moment to think. As they're thinking, Charlie, when you wrote SAQs for a describe style prompt, how many sentences do you think you would have written?
2, 3. No,
2 or 3?
It really depends.
Yeah.
For this one, I would probably do 3.
Yeah. Number of sentences isn't critical, but we're trying to think of these as short answer so that you can move through the simpler prompts and get to, because part C you can already see is an explain prompt where you're going to have to give more detail. And so if you can think in terms of smaller answers. All right, some part B responses. People are typing. Tanya's asking, what were the 4 responses to imperialism? I will give them to you again, but I want to give people a chance to think and write a little bit before I give away answers. And because it's a describe prompt, you don't necessarily need to know the names, because I just picked 4 names, 4 buckets, categories of resistance. You don't have to remember that terminology. Describe another way that people responded to imperialism. Okay, another response can include cultural resistance seen in the Maji rebellion. Yeah, Dan, I would encourage you to always be thinking in complete sentences. So your second sentence, right? Give me a complete sentence about the Maji rebellion. How is that a different response to imperialism? But I love that you're giving me a specific example to talk about cultural resistance. That's awesome. People also responded non-violently with peaceful protests, an example being the Salt March. Tanya, this is a good answer because I didn't give you a date in this prompt. And so the Salt March, which occurred in the 20th century, is a response to imperialism in India. And you absolutely could use that. If there was a date in this, if I was asking you specifically about 19th century responses, you'd want to make sure your example is from there, but I didn't give you a date, so you get to pick the examples you know, which is awesome. So, the Africans seem like they're using horses for fighting, just like the Europeans, showing aspects of reform. That's an interesting one because Part B doesn't specifically ask you to reference the image, but I think that's interesting that you're choosing to reference the image. The Europeans and Africans both using horses, maybe not necessarily an example of reform because horses have been used throughout different parts of Africa, especially northern Africa, for a really long time, thousands of years. But I like the way that you were thinking, trying to go for that. Cultural rebellions, talking about the Xhosa cattle killing movement. We've got an example here about surrender and Lesotho, talking about nationalism and the creation of new states, or the Boxer Rebellion in China. So jumping all the way across the world. Most of our examples today have been from Africa, but you can pull examples from other places. Reform, talking about Japan as a response to imperialism from other places. Yeah, these are great. Why don't you guys start thinking about Part C, which asks you to explain a limitation of this source for understanding responses to imperialism. So I'll read you the caption again. This picture is by an artist named Henri Meyer. And the name of it is The Capture of Toure Samari, 1835 to 1900 by Lieutenant Yakin near Guillemot in 1898. Charlie, as people are trying to phrase their answers about limitations, given that you probably had not seen this source before I dumped it in our slide deck for tonight, what inferences or assumptions could you make about this source, just from your observation of it?
Just from my observation of it, I could tell you that it's made by someone who is European or had some type of training in European style art.
Okay. Because you're an art history student, so you're seeing the style of art. How would a world history student who's not taking art history know that same fact?
You can look at the artist name, which is probably what I would do. You see Henri Meyer, and it's almost, even though there was French colonization in Africa, it's still too early for Africans to still adopt French names. We don't really see that. We see that in Senegal, starting maybe like the 1900s, but not at this point. So we see Henri Meyer, and we're thinking this is most likely French, not someone in Mali.
Okay, so Charlie's given you some great clues to be thinking about limitations of this source based on what she knows in the source. Okay, I'm going to answer the question and then I'll start reading examples that are popping in. When considering limitations, do you address bias? So bias is a type of limitation. There are lots of ways that a source could be limited for understanding a particular topic in history. This question of limitations is one, but not the only way that the College Board sometimes likes to ask you about your ability to do sourcing for a document. And bias is a potential limitation. If a source has a bias that limits its ability to convey information, you would want to explain that. So you can address bias. I wouldn't make that my whole answer, right? We need to explain it. C is phrased as an explain, and this is the type of SAQ prompt that's going to require the most detail. So we've got an answer that I'll read out loud from Dan, and we'll see if other people have got some good ideas. One limitation of the source is that it only provides one perspective of how it went down in one continent. This one, for example, is in Africa and only shows what violent resistance would be like. So a limitation of this source is that it is specific to one place and time. And it doesn't give us information about Indian responses to imperialism or Balkan, Eastern European responses, or really even other African responses to imperialism. So yeah, that's a limitation of this source. Nicely done, Dan. Anybody else willing to throw out an answer? We see people fighting on horseback, but this doesn't necessarily mean it is a response to imperialism. That's true, because not all responses to imperialism were violent. Yes. Yeah, I think, Tanya, I would want you to give me, I don't think that the issue is that necessarily I don't think the issue of being on horseback matches the rest of your answer. But I love that you're trying, right? This was a hard question. I gave you a hard one for the third part. I wanted to push people and challenge you just a little bit. All right, William's got a long one for us. Spend some time on this, William. Let's read it. The document was created by Meyer rather than Yakin, but good to identify that it's a European artist. If I were an AP reader, I could just hold my finger over the wrong name and I could read it as the document was created by a European artist. This indicates a bias in the creation of the document as it depicts the African people being drastically overpowered by Europeans. However, many rebellions against imperialist movements were successful in resisting European influence. For example, the Ethiopians were able to successfully resist the Italians in 1896 due to adequate military power. William, that answer works great. You've done a nice job of keeping it succinct, linking it to the document, linking it to your knowledge of world history, showing us that limitation. I like that answer. Charlie, how would you have answered part C?
I would have gone with just saying that it was a European artist. European artist is going to have bias to depict their people as mighty and stronger. And you can see that the Europeans are the only people showing weapons. So it makes they're trying to make the Africans look primitive in this by showing them without any weapons. You see the Europeans with man in the back has either like a sword on his back or some type of like rifle. I can't really tell because the picture's blurry, but you can see that they have all these advanced types of military technology and the Africans don't. So that would be one limitation or bias of this.
Yep. So acknowledging, right, that the artist is a European. As a European, he's going to highlight his people. He's going to maybe not give us the full story in what these resistance or rebellion movements looked like on the part of Africans. Yeah, these are some really great answers. I see a few other folks popping in answers. These are awesome. I'm not going to be able to respond to all of them, but this is good practice for you. I want to show one more set of questions, just thinking a little differently about this topic, right? Because sometimes we're going to have SAQs that are stimulus-based, and sometimes our SAQs are going to be non-stimulus-based. So we've got 3 parts here. Looking at our time and wanting to be respectful of those of you who need to take care of chores or family members, or if you're on the West Coast, maybe eat dinner. I'll read all 3 of them. And if you want to take a couple minutes and answer one of them, you can pick A, B, or C, and just label it with which one you're answering and try out one more practice answer. So part A asks, they're all explain prompts, which is why I'm saying just maybe try answering one. So part A, explain one way that Indigenous peoples used religious ideas to inform their resistance against imperialism. So because it's an explain, we've got to go beyond just stating the example, but giving some detail about it. Part B, explain one rationale besides religion that Indigenous peoples used to justify rebellion or resistance against imperialism. Part C, explain one reason why some Indigenous groups did not resist or rebel against imperialism. So pick one of those, try on and explain response. See if you can fill up the chat so fast that I can't read it again like you did last time. Thank you, Mr. Beckman, for jumping back through the chat to give some specific feedback to folks. While you are thinking, I'm going to fill some of the dead air by reminding you that we have our community pages on Fiveable with some practice SAQs open now. for you to practice with and get some feedback on. So if you are interested in those, you can go to community.fiveable.me and take a look at some different SAQs from some different time periods. Mr. Beckman has been hard at work writing SAQs for us to include, and Mr. Little and myself have been jumping in and giving some feedback. Students have also been giving each other feedback on their SAQ practices. So those are other places where you can get practice, especially if you're in a situation where you're not currently receiving a lot of teacher support. I hope that you are, but I know that it really varies from place to place around the country. Leo, you said you had a question about the last group of SAQ questions. I answered it in comment in the question box, but I can answer it out loud while people are still thinking and writing. Your question was, would an answer of the image doesn't encompass all pieces of Indigenous responses work for Part C? I think that's a good start to an answer. I think you would need to elaborate on that and give some more detail about it, right? Acknowledging a limitation is that that it's finite, it's limited to a place and time is reasonable. But also be thinking about how you would explain that, because it is an explain prompt. Okay, starting to get some answers coming in here. Awesome. An answer to Part A. Indigenous peoples used religious ideas since they believed that it gave them special powers from their ancestors, allowing unity or have the ability to take over the imperialists. An example would be the ghost dance, since Indigenous people did special dances to get powers to take over the Americans. The spiritual powers allowed the people to strengthen their will to fight the imperialists. That last sentence is the thing that brings your whole answer together, Parthena. That's what makes it golden. So thank you for writing your way all the way into a really good answer there. Rebecca, for Part B, nationalist identities. Awesome. That's another rationale. I'll read the whole answer. Nationalist identities were a rationale besides religion that Indigenous peoples used to justify rebellion or resistance. People in Serbia and Hungary came together under the Ottoman Empire and united through shared characteristics, giving them a reason to be independent and justify resistance against imperialism. You're nailing it with these. These are awesome, guys. William is giving another good example about the ghost dance for Part A. Henry's got an answer for Part C. Some Indigenous groups did not resist because they had some kind of incentive to cooperate. Indian princes, for example, were often given education for their children and a fair amount of power by British colonizers. We didn't get to talk about that tonight, but awesome for remembering that, Henry. Because of the incentives for cooperation with incoming powers, they saw no reason to resist. Yes, that's a great answer, Henry. And I love that you're choosing an example that you can describe. Right? You don't necessarily need to know the names of the Indian princes. You can describe their situation and their characteristics to pull detail into your answer. That's awesome. Cole, you're wanting to answer Part A. How did they use religious ideas to inform their resistance? I mean, inform as in to justify, or to how did the religion play into the resistance movements? It's a kind of a weird phrasing. I am not as good at writing SAQs as Mr. Beckman. So I was just trying to get you guys thinking about religion and culture and recapping what you learned about those. So that's what I meant by that. Hopefully that helps you put together an answer. All right. So Tanya, for Part C, an example would be the use of reform used by Japan when they began to industrialize in an attempt to catch up with Western civilization. Their intention was to overcome US and European powers. So Tanya, I think for that answer, if you could give me one or two more sentences that explains why that reform movement was not resistance or rebellion, that would strengthen your answer and make it a little bit better. So just write a little bit more. And I think that you would be there. Rom, hi Rom. Rom's one of my students as well. Let's read yours. One way Indigenous people responded was by not resisting or rebelling to Indigenous forces. This was mainly due to the fact that the impacted area accepted the imperialist rule since they saw benefits such as protection from the ruler. A good example would be Lesotho surrendering. So Rom, I'm curious whether you think the answer that you wrote is an answer to part B or part C, because you have phrased the beginning part, one way Indigenous people responded, so another like rationale. But then mostly your answer looks like a part C, which is just explaining why they didn't resist. And if you're answering part C, I think it's a good answer. You wouldn't need the first sentence because we know that's a response of not resisting or rebelling because it's right there in the question. It's a little bit funky there in that first sentence, but overall, the answer is good. You're giving reasoning, you're giving an example for that and talking about the benefit of joining versus resisting. So that's great. Okay, getting some awesome follow-up questions. Holy moly. Do you think the AP people will mark points for spelling mistakes? I do not think they will do so. Mr. Beckman is also with me on that. Absolutely not. Test is going to be online. I have no idea about whether or not you'll be able to use spell check. I can tell you right now, it won't matter. Spelling, grammar, none of that matters. If I can understand your words and figure out how they relate to some part of the question, that's what we're going to be counting. Yeah. Awesome. And Parthena is mentioning for econ, you can take a picture of your work and send it to the AP. That's actually going to be true. One thing for those of you who are concerned about your devices or your access for the AP exam, you can take these home exams on any device. And that includes handwriting your answers, taking a picture of your answer and uploading it. That's going to be an option as well. We're going to get a lot more detail about that on April 3rd, and we'll follow up in our various communication channels with you about that. So yes, that will be. William's question about open book. I've been hearing rumors about open book. The College Board isn't being specific about that. It's a 45-minute test. I would count on needing to know the information. That would be my advice. Know it. Know your stuff.
Great. For history, it's kind of hard to do open book.
Yeah.
Just because it's more like a memorization test. But if you're taking calc or chemistry or anything that's like equations based, I've heard about rumors about it being open book from like other platforms like that I know of like other than Fiveable, other AP platforms that have been saying that it's open book because they've emailed AP coordinators. I would say that would make sense for it to be open book so they just know everyone's on the same playing field. Like you have the option to do it, or you have the option not to do it.
But it's timed. You have to know your stuff. Open book or not, the timed nature of it means that it's still worth studying. And just printing out study guides and having them at your fingertips is not the same as studying and paying attention. So all of you who are here tonight answering SAQs in the chat, you are doing the work that is going to get you ready for the exam. This is what's going to get you ready. This is what's going to get you the performance that you want from yourself on this free response of some kind that we'll find out about April 3rd. So wait a week. Yeah. All right, folks, I can take maybe a couple more minutes of last minute questions, but we are well over our hour mark. So if you need to head out, peace be with you. Dan is dropping in yet another great answer. Yeah, Dan, that answer is beautiful for part C. I love that you're continuing to practice, that you're pushing through some really challenging questions. Parthen is asking me a specific question about, are we going to be coming back to school at the date that the governor said we might? And honestly, I have no idea. Every time I've thought I knew something, it has changed. So I'm just living in the I don't know anymore. And it looks like all your friends, Parthena, say, well, there's no way we're going back to school. Who knows what's going to be happening? Stay tuned. Listen to your teachers. Wash your hands. Stay at home. Do all the things.
Yeah. Especially since like a state like Kansas is out for the rest of the year and they don't have as many cases as, let's say, Washington State or like New Jersey where I am. I highly doubt we're going back this year.
Yeah.
For this year, at least.
I'm not willing to speculate out loud because as a school district employee, could get myself in a bit of trouble making things up and spreading rumors. So check your email, listen to your teachers. All right, friends, you guys are fantastic and amazing. I wish you all the best. Please keep coming back for future streams. We are working hard at Fiveable to get things ready for you and to make sure that you have everything you need. And if there's something we're not providing that you think we should provide, please let us know. Amanda, our supreme leader, is working so hard to make sure that students have what they need. And the way that we know that we're doing our jobs right is that students tell us. So please, please, please tell us what it is you think would be helpful to you. We do have the Cram Pass available if you're wanting some extra help and support. Mr. Beckman is running that, and he is awesome. I wish I could have taken history in Mr. Beckman's class when I was a student. And you can find that information on Fiveable, including like pricing and schedules and all that good stuff. But even if you can't afford Cram Pass, like if you're in a situation where free is all you can afford, we will still be here. We're going to be here every Thursday night at 8 Eastern, 5 Pacific. We're going to be streaming on Mondays and Tuesdays during the day as well, that you can kind of fit in around your various online classes and other things that you have to do. And all of our replays are free and downloadable. So you can always come back to something if you miss it live. All right. Question about what units we'll be covering. Thursday night sessions are covering units 1 through 6. We're going to be reviewing content that will be on the exam, and our bonus sessions during the daytime. We've got Q&A sessions on Tuesdays and Monday sessions covering 20th century content because we want you to learn it. Cram sessions are going to be Tuesday nights. So just lots of really good stuff happening. Thanks everybody for sticking with us all the way through this. You're all fantastic. We'll see you again soon. Bye everybody.